This is book 2 of the Raina series. This book is called Ripples. This is part 1, chapter 1. Have you ever had one of those nagging feelings? The kind that completely consumes your thoughts? Not the small, did I turn the light off or lock the door kind. The intense, no matter what's going on around you, you can't focus on anything but that feeling kind. It makes your heart beat faster, your stomach clench, and you find yourself either looking around trying to find it or staring at nothing hoping the answer will come to you. The world around you dims and all of your senses are focused on finding the source. A silent panic suffocates you as the minutes slip by. Okay, maybe that's a bit theatrical, but that's how I felt, sort of. The ride home from the party was quiet, at least on my part. Jonathan, my now official vampire boyfriend, had plenty to talk about with our dads, who sat in the seat across from us. He even included my best friend Track in the conversation. Jonathan held my hand and smiled at me a lot, but I pretended to be interested in the scenery as it went past the tinted window of our closed car. In reality, I was still trying to figure out why I couldn't shake that odd feeling. I couldn't even remember exactly when it started. Yesterday, maybe? I frowned, squinting my eyes as if that would somehow help me find the answer. It was still dark outside, but the colors in the sky were warning us that it wouldn't be for long. The red light on the door panel told us vampires that sunrise was close and that it wasn't safe to step outside. The readout below it gave the actual time, and then how long before sunrise. The last one shows 22 minutes and 11 seconds. Was it the fear of the coming daylight? I sighed. Now that was dramatic. I had ridden in closed cars plenty of time. That wasn't it. I felt their stares at times, Track's especially. He had been my best friend for so many years, and now all of that was changing. It had started when I told Jonathan that I'd be his girlfriend. I didn't want it to change, but everyone told me it had to, including Track. He was a pure-blood werewolf, so was my grandmother. I was only 1/4 wolf, but the pull of that side of my DNA was strong, and had become even stronger lately. Unfortunately, those in the vampire world had a hard time understanding wolves and our pack ways. My father, being a vampire, had tried to be very understanding, but I could tell he wished I didn't need it so much. I chuckled out the dark window as I remembered the first time my dad found Track curled up in my bed. That seemed so long ago, and I guess it was, since more than half a century had passed between then and now. At first I thought he was going to lose his mind or do something horrible to Track. I threw myself between them and tried to explain to my dad, to help him understand that it was a pack thing. I didn't get to go to Polson, the town where my pack lived, very often. I had to sleep alone in my huge bed every night. That was torture for a werewolf. My dad didn't throw Track out, but I could see in his eyes he wasn't happy about it, in the least. My dad went with me to Polson at first. He would let me play, but kept a close eye on me. My bodyguards were just as leery when we went there. They hovered over me as if the others were either going to steal me or hurt me. Both were ridiculous. The werewolves were my friends and treated me like family from the very beginning. My mother was half werewolf, and like my grandmother, she had been part of this pack as well. Track's dad, along with the pack alpha, spent a lot of time talking with my dad. They spent hour after hour trying to help him understand, although none of them were sure why it was so strong in me, considering the weak bloodline. Finally, after several of these visits, Track was allowed in the manor whenever he wanted. It was still hard on my dad. but he loved me and wanted me happy. The smile slipped from my face. Track was no longer allowed to sleep with me. It was considered inappropriate now that Jonathan and I were a couple. They all knew deep down there was nothing sexual about it. It was so completely innocent, an instinct and need built into us. But no matter how hard they tried to understand, they weren't werewolves. Unless you were one, you just didn't get it. It started to rain then, and the smile returned as I leaned closer to the deeply tinted windows. Watching the rain soothed and excited me at the same time. My finger touched the glass to meet the drops that beaded up on the window of the SUV, not realizing I had pulled my hand out of Jonathan's. The speed forced them to shiver, streak, and then be consumed by the road behind us. I heard thunder rumble in the distance and closed my eyes, letting the sensation echo through me. My chin lifted a little as I imagined the cool drops against my even cooler skin. I heard my name and turned, blinking slowly. The sounds inside the car filled my ears, pushing away the serenity of the storm and leaving me feeling a little sad. Jonathan smiled at me with those amazing gray eyes and perfect smile. Even among vampires he was gorgeous, and that was saying something. I gave a soft sigh, and he chuckled as I slowly looked over his features, my eyes drinking him in as I reluctantly pulled myself back to the present. "Looks like it's going to be a bad storm," he stated, leaning over me to glance out the window. To emphasize that, lightning exploded and flashed around us. Jonathan took my hand and gave it a soft squeeze. "Don't worry, you'll sleep through it." Track chuckled in the seat across from us. His suit jacket crumpled in a pile next to him. He had taken it off the first chance he got, but he still looked handsome in the dark slacks and shirt. That mischievous bad boy look seeped out, though, no matter the finery it was wrapped in. When Jonathan turned to him, Track shrugged and smiled. Raina loves thunderstorms. Jonathan's jaw tightened for just an instant. Then he turned his smile back on me. "Well then, when we get to the manor, we'll find a nice quiet place to sit and watch it, if you aren't too tired." "I would like that," I said quietly. Something about storms made you feel like you should whisper. At least they did for me. Besides, maybe it would help me get rid of this horrible feeling and let me actually enjoy some part of this night. I put a free hand over my stomach and turned back to the window. It was light outside when we pulled through the massive gates to the manor. The rain was coming sideways now, and the werewolf in the security booth looked like an oddly smeared painting as he nodded to us when we drove past. The cars pulled into the large garage and up to the door that led inside. We all waited. Once the garage doors were sealed, a uniformed man stepped up to the car. I was the last one out. Jonathan reached in and lifted me out, since it was hard to climb out of a tall SUV in a full-length gown. It still amazed me that the party to announce our official dating status was so large and so formal. Vampires did love their rituals, though. My dad's status in the vampire world had a lot to do with it, too. It wasn't every day that the reclusive daughter of the second highest ranking vampire started to date. Officially, that is. Add the fact that I was his only child, and you start to get the picture. My dad and Jonathan had insisted on this large party, and I had agreed to make them both happy. Over 300 guests had showed. To vampires, announcing that you were officially dating was a big thing. I get that, but this seemed like a bit much, even under those circumstances. Jonathan took my hand again and we walked inside. I gave him a small smile and was grateful that I had learned to keep my private thoughts my own. During one of my shifts from vampire to werewolf, or was it from werewolf to vampire? Anyhow, I had learned, without trying, to let Track and Jonathan hear my thoughts. It didn't work with anyone else, and I couldn't hear their thoughts, but I had also learned how to keep my deeper thoughts to myself. It took several embarrassing slips, but I finally figured out how to think without them hearing. Our large group stopped just inside the manor, and everyone stood talking about how great the party was. I felt that strange pull again and turned, glancing at a large picture on the wall. It was a portrait of my dad and mom. She was as beautiful as he was handsome. Her dark brown hair was long, her green eyes sparkled as she seemed to smile down at me. I smiled back up at her and felt a small twinge of sadness. I didn't know her, other than the stories and the pictures, but I had so many questions to ask her. She was a hybrid. Like most, though, she didn't shift, but I wondered how she coped with it. Which pull was stronger for her? Did she have a hard time leaving the pack for my father? What was my dad like when they dated? Why couldn't Track stay here? I let out a shaky sigh, my heart tightening a bit. Suddenly, Aunt Mary grabbed me and hugged me tightly. "Poor dear, look at you. Is everything all right?" Yes, I stuttered, wondering what I had done to get that reaction. She frowned at me, shaking her head as her eyes inspected me. "You haven't heard a word we've been saying, have you?" "Oh, I'm sorry," I whispered, biting my lower lip and looking around at the others. Jonathan smiled, taking my hand and saving me from her grip. "She's just a bit overwhelmed and tired," he explained to his aunt and the others that were watching me now. His Aunt Mary nodded, then smiled at me. "I can't wait to see the pictures." She put her hands to her chest. "Oh, the two of you look like something right out of the movies." I had to smile then. Jonathan's Aunt Mary was wonderful, and I liked her a lot, but she was definitely a bit different. Finally, most of the group headed off to their rooms to change. My dad hugged me tightly, then kissed the top of my head. When he pulled back, I looked past his smile to his eyes. If vampires had tears, I think his would be moist. I frowned, and he shook his head. "You're growing up," he stated quietly, and then shook his head again. Finally, the only ones left were me, Jonathan, and Track. Jonathan looked at me. "Now let's get changed and then go find somewhere to watch the storm." His gray eyes sparkled, and I had to smile. Then I turned to Track, but Jonathan chuckled. "I'm sure Track must be exhausted." My smile fell, and I sighed. While vampires could stay up for days on end without needing sleep, werewolves were not so capable. Since I was 1/4 werewolf, I could stay up 2 days tops, but I had gotten into a routine of sleeping each day. Track, though, was a werewolf, and it was already way past his normal bedtime. The two exchanged a look, but it was gone before I could tell what it was. Track smiled at me. "I'll be here tonight." Then he reached forward and pulled me out of Jonathan's grip. I smiled at him, and he hugged me, then kissed my forehead. "You looked beautiful tonight," he whispered into my ear. I hugged him tightly, not wanting to let him go. He was my rock. He always had been. I inhaled slowly, his scent swimming through me. Each werewolf had their own unique scent, but each pack member had a second scent that tied them together, a shared scent that meant comfort, safety, happiness, and family. I wanted to curl up next to him and talk until we couldn't stay awake any longer. I wanted to talk about the weird feeling, about my mother, about the storm, anything but the party. That seems odd, but I desperately wanted my best friend right then. Jonathan cleared his throat and Track chuckled, keeping his arms around me. I nuzzled him, and he leaned down, his lips on the top of my head. There was a movement to the side, and I finally straightened up, realizing that this fell into the no longer appropriate category, as much as I hated that. Track smiled down at me. His brown eyes were moist, but they sparkled, and they said silently, "I will always be here for you." Finally, he stepped back, gave Jonathan a hard nod, and turned towards the door to the garage. We watched him leave, and I felt the sadness seep in and try to consume me. Track and I had shared so much together. I couldn't imagine a life without him in it every day. The pain tightened in my chest, and Jonathan squeezed my hand, which I hadn't realized he was holding. "Ready for some storm watching?" he said in a tone that was meant to sound excited. He and Track didn't like each other as much as I wished they did, but I was trying to work on that. I didn't have the heart to tell Jonathan that it just wasn't the same when it was light out, so I let him walk me to my room, and then he went to change while I did the same. As beautiful as my gown was eager to take it off. I was not a dress kind of girl, let alone a full-length, formal, sparkly kind. For me, it was usually jeans and a t-shirt. Shoes were only added when necessary. First, I went to my dresser and pulled out a small box. Then I carefully slipped the beautiful earrings off, smiling as I looked at them in my hand. I had to send Track's mom some sort of thank you for them. They were the ones she wore on her wedding day. What thank you could show her just how much that meant to me? I laid them, very gently, in the box that sat on the dresser, smiling at it until I felt my eyes water. Still feeling a bit emotional, I pulled my necklace up, and ignoring the tiny gold box that held my tracking device, I fingered the 2 charms that hung on either side. The small golden wolf head rolled between my fingers, and I smiled. Then I lifted the other one, the symbol of the Polson pack. A feeling of pride washed over me, and then that odd feeling tugged at me again. I frowned, running a finger over the marking, hoping it would somehow help. It tugged me again, and I found myself looking towards my window. I frowned and tilted my head, listening, as if something or someone would whisper the answer to this very annoying mystery. Finally, I plopped down on the bench and started to undo my hair. I was still trying to get all the pins out when he came in. I was hunched over a pile of bent pins, grumbling. "Here, let me help you," he smiled, and I gave a soft huff and nodded. He stood behind me and started to pull out the colored pins. I held my hand out, and he dropped them in my palm. "How many are there?" he chuckled, and I shrugged. "I have no idea." Jonathan worked diligently, and after several minutes I was able to run a brush through my hair and only found one more. "Would you mind if I took a quick shower?" I asked. "Take your time." I grinned, grabbed some PJ pants and a top, and headed to my bathroom. When I stepped under the water, I sighed loudly and lifted my head, letting it wash over me. I loved long, hot showers. The water drowned out all the sounds around you. The water rushed down your body and left your mind to think about anything or absolutely nothing at all. This time, I opted for nothing at all. I finally grabbed the shampoo and washed my hair, glad to be rid of the hairspray and gel and who knows what other products Aunt Mary's hairdresser had put in it. Next, I washed me, slowly, as if it were the last shower I would get, and I had to savor it. When there wasn't anything else to do, I stood under the shower head and let it consume me a while longer. The water, like a hard storm, drowned out all thoughts and pushed the real world away. Finally, with another deep sigh, I stepped out and shivered, but not from the cold. The strange feeling hit me again, and I looked towards the door, listening. When nothing happened, I grabbed a towel and wrapped it around me, still glancing at the door. Since I had already made him wait so long, I just towel-dried my hair and ran a brush through it. When I was dressed, I tossed the expensive gown over the hamper and walked out. Jonathan wasn't in my room. I looked around and then stepped towards the door. My bodyguards, Michael and Martin, were standing there, hands crossed in front of them like an odd pair of massive twins. "Have you seen Jonathan?" I asked, still surprised that he had left. "I'm right here," came a voice, and we all turned to see him jogging over. He kissed my cheek. "Sorry, you seem to be enjoying the showers, so I took the time to go find the perfect place to watch the storm." He grinned, and I frowned. I had forgotten about that. "Is it still going?" "Harder than ever," he stated eagerly, the excitement dancing in his eyes. I had to smile, and even though I was extremely tired, I let him walk me down the hall and then up the stairs. We turned down another hall and finally stopped in front of a set of double doors. I looked at it, trying to remember what room was behind it. There were so many here. Some I don't know if I've ever actually been in. My smile widened when I remembered. This was an old playroom of mine. I hadn't used it in years. Don't ask how many. Vampires are funny about admitting their age. When he opened the doors, he moved to one side and I stepped in. The room was clean and fresh. Nothing but my hidden closet was left to dust around here. I smiled at my old things as we walked through the room, the memories flooding through my mind. The dollhouse that I sat and played at for hours was now folded up in a corner. A wooden puppet show leaned against another wall. The puppets hung lifeless on pegs next to it. I chuckled as I remembered Track threatening my very life if I ever told anyone that he would play with me here. The large wardrobe caught my eye and I chuckled again, remembering Track and I pulling out the costumes and props that were packed inside. We had been everything from Egyptian royalty to pirates, and had been to every corner of the world and several others, all within these four walls. Jonathan gave my hand a squeeze and I turned, the tilt from memory to reality making me a bit dizzy. There was a large chaise lounge set up near the massive window now. Because it was light outside, the security shield covered it, making it seem almost like nighttime. With a nod behind him, the lights went out and the doors closed. We sat on the seat with our legs stretched out in front of us. He pulled me into his arms. I laid my head on his shoulder and closed my eyes. I could hear the storm then. It was muffled, but my vampire ears could pick out the hard rain and the crash of thunder. I fell asleep listening to it, pretending I was out there instead of in here. I dreamt of lying on a bed of leaves with the storm just outside the cave that kept me dry. Somewhere in my dream I heard talking. It was distant and low, and I couldn't make out the words. It buzzed in my ear, but each time I tried to focus on it, it went away. Finally, I let it wash over me. The soft, unknown sounds soothed me, and a feeling of complete contentment wrapped around me. When I woke up, I was still smiling. I inhaled deeply, half expecting to smell the fresh, crisp air that comes only after a hard storm. When those scents didn't greet me, I blinked and looked around, then quickly sat up, realizing my head had been laying in Jonathan's lap. He smiled over at me. "Good evening." I only nodded, looking around to try to get my bearings. I pushed my hair out of my face and sighed. "Sorry I fell asleep." "I expected you to," he grinned. "I'm just glad that I got to hold you without fear of Aunt Mary hauling me away." That made me smile. Now that we were official, it was okay for us to do this. Up until the party, however, Aunt Mary had threatened to lock Jonathan in a room to make sure he kept to the appropriate code of conduct all vampires seem to thrive on. I yawned, covering my mouth, and then sat up more. It was a wonderful storm, I smiled, remembering the dream. "Every day I learn something new about you," he said in a soft but happy tone. "It seems a huge picture window is definitely in order when we move." My eyes widened, and he leaned forward, his great eyes sparkling. It will be our place, Raina, and I want you to be happy there. He leaned closer and kissed me. His soft lips helped ease the panic of his words. I had never lived anywhere besides the manor. We couldn't move out until we were actually unioned, what werewolves and humans call married, but Jonathan had already been looking at places online. For someone that wanted to be so grown up at times, the thought of leaving the manor terrified me. Due to my father's position, I was used to living a very sheltered life, with bodyguards following my every movement. It's what I knew. It's all I knew. Then, when my shifting started and my wolf blood decided to come to the surface, the security at the manor increased to where I was not even allowed outside now, for my safety as well as others. I didn't know if I was ready for out there, even with my wonderful Jonathan at my side. How ironic was that? I used to crave freedom, excitement, and adventure. Now that it was knocking at my door, I was afraid of it. "What's wrong?" he asked, moving the hair from my face. I shrugged, suddenly feeling like a child. "I thought we were going to be honest with each other." "Oh, that." I looked around the room. I guess maybe being in here, with so many memories, makes me a bit sad to think about leaving. I was sure there was enough truth in that to meet his requirements. "We'll go slow," he chuckled. "I'm not going to show up one day with movers and just haul you away." My eyes widened and he pulled me back into his arms. "You know, most females can't wait to get out of their parents' house and live on their own." That was probably true, but there wasn't much about me that was normal. Besides, I love my dad. Next to Track, he was my best friend. When I didn't reply, he gave me a soft hug. "We'll go slow, I promise." I nodded and smiled. He was awesome. His watch beeped and he lifted it so we could both see. 5 p.m., he stated. "You haven't eaten in a long time." Another oddity about me, before the shifting started, I was on a very tight eating schedule. The time and the temperature had to be regulated. But the evening of the party, I had tried to drink and couldn't swallow it. Vampires don't eat food. We drink blood. Most of us are civilized and drink cloned or bank blood, though having a human pet had come back into fashion among some circles. I cringed at that thought. "Let me get your thermos," he stated, shifting so I had to move. When he stood, I followed and we walked to the door. Michael was there with my thermos in his hand. Jonathan took it, checked the readout, and turned to me. His eyes were worried, but he smiled as he handed it to me. As I lifted it to my lips, I silently hoped it would not go as bad as the last time. Luckily, I finished it without incident until the very last swallow. There was a loud thud down in the hallway, and I gasped, sucking the liquid into my lungs. I choked and coughed, dropping the thermos and grabbing my throat, my eyes wide. I was still getting used to having working lungs in this form, but my body knew the liquid did not belong where it was. Jonathan was yelling something, but I was bent forward now, my lungs fighting to get rid of the foreign matter. 2 arms went around me from behind, and I heard Track in my ear. "Slow breaths, Ray. It's okay." I nodded, my eyes watering but my panic easing. He held me and talked me through the painful ordeal, whispering encouragement and instructing me how to let my lungs do the work. Within a few minutes, I was breathing normally again. A maid rushed up with a wet towel in her hand and a very worried look on her face. Jonathan took the cloth, gave her a polite nod, and turned to wipe my face. Track stood back and shook his head. "Man, you trying to give us a heart attack?" For some reason, that struck me as funny. Very funny. I don't know if it was because vampires didn't have beating hearts or what, but I started to giggle and then laugh, and I couldn't stop. I was laughing so hard that my eyes started to water again, and I think I even snorted at one point. My tender lungs and throat didn't appreciate it, and my sides started to ache. Jonathan and Track's dumbfounded looks did not help at all. Finally, I had to put one hand on the wall to brace myself and the other over my stomach, which also wasn't happy with me right now. Finally, it slowed. My cheeks were wet again, and I was gasping to take in air, trying to slowly regain my composure. Jonathan had a hand on my back now, and I nodded. "I'm good." I finally got out. I pushed off the wall, cleared my throat, and nodded again. Track was biting his cheek to keep a straight face, and I had to look away as the giggles started to creep up again. How I could think any of this was funny, I have no idea. I cleared my throat again and gave another nod. Slowly and reluctantly, I looked at the faces that stood watching me. Track was the only one that didn't look like I might have gone completely mad or might drop completely dead at any moment. Jonathan was still just behind me, his hand rubbing my back slowly, but I could see his worried look from the corner of my eye. "Okay, I think I'm done making a complete fool out of myself," I whispered, my voice a little raspy. Was all Track said, and I put my hand up to stop him, afraid I would lose it again. The hallway went silent as I drew a few slow breaths and then a long, deep one. I stole a quick glance at Track and smiled. Okay, I was done, I hope. Jonathan's phone rang and he pulled it out of his pocket. He gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and then stepped away as he answered it. I was happy for the interruption. Maybe now I could regain some dignity. I even got brave and smiled at Track, who winked back. As he did, my cousin Alyssa walked up. My smile dipped a little and Track turned. She gave Jonathan a wave and then came over to us. "I didn't get a chance to see much of you at the party." She smiled in a way that said she didn't really care, and then confirmed it by adding, "I was so busy mingling." My brows went up. Then she did that thing with her shoulder and smiled. "To be honest, I did spend quite a lot of time with a certain vampire." When neither Track nor I commented, she wiggled her brows. "Taryn Wendell!" She watched us closely, as if that name should have invoked some great response. When it didn't, she frowned. "You can't seriously tell me you haven't heard of him?" She looked around and seeing Jonathan still on the phone, she huffed. "He's very important and wealthy vampire," she stated, giving a small nod. "I see," I stated, biting my cheek and hoping that I wouldn't get another case of the giggles. It had been bad enough in front of these guys. It would be completely humiliating in front of her. She went on to tell us how this Taryn was on 2 of the major councils, even though neither was the Blood Council. He also ran a large business in the city. "Right here," she added, clasping her hands together. "I'm expecting him to call my dad and ask permission to see me again." She winked. That's great, Alyssa," I finally put in, realizing I should probably say something. She was bouncing on her toes when Jonathan walked back over. Then she looked at me. My brows wrinkled as she pursed her lips. Her eyes darted to Jonathan and then back to me. "Oh," I stated, realizing she wanted me to tell him. I turned to Jonathan and did just that. "That's great, Alyssa. I hear Taryn's a nice guy," he replied, giving her a polite smile and then looking me over as if I might have fallen ill in the last few minutes that he was on the phone. "So you do know him," she shrilled, and I actually winced at the octave she managed to hit. Jonathan put his arm around my waist, I think to help hold me up. "He's one of my distributors, but I don't usually deal with him directly. I met him once when I was asked to speak at one of the council meetings." "Of course, he's too busy to do that stuff himself," she chuckled, waving her hand in front of her. I snuck a look at Track, who rolled his eyes. Alyssa caught it, though, and her lip twitched. Then her eyes seemed to twinkle for a split second, and she turned back to Jonathan. "I heard you're leaving tomorrow," she said, changing her evil smile to a pout. "I was hoping that I could invite Taryn here and we could all visit." My eyes widened and I looked at Jonathan. "Tomorrow? Oh, I thought you didn't know?" Alyssa exclaimed with a fake gasp, putting her hand to her mouth. Jonathan stepped in front of me, putting his back to her. "I didn't plan on you hearing about it this way," he stated, his gray eyes locking onto mine. "I wanted to spend the evening together and discuss it." I looked down at the floor, and Track gave a low growl. And that's where I'm going to end part 1.